This is an all-new full-frame lens from 7Artisans. It's the 15mm f4, and it's all metal, it's all manual, but perhaps the most important thing about this lens is the impressively low price of around $350 US, which I've learned recently, if you're looking for a cheap ultra-wide angle for your full-frame Sony mirrorless camera, there's not a ton of options out there. So if this lens is good, it's an important one. It comes in a white box. Inside there is a manual, some padding, and the lens. Plastic front and rear lens caps, and that's it. The lens is solid, it's made out of metal, and even the lens hood is made out of metal as well. In total, this is 536 grams, which is significant for the size. It feels solid, well built, with great tolerances everywhere. Starting at the rear, there is a metal mount with no electronic connections and no weather sealing gasket either. The aperture ring is nice and clicky, moving from f4 to f22 in a very smooth and tactile way. In front of that is a buttery smooth, well-damped focus ring with about 140 degrees of rotation. It's nice and smooth and again well executed. The one negative I will point out is the focal distance scale is just printed on, not engraved and printed, so I'm not sure how well that will hold up over time. Around the front there is a nice domed front lens element and a bunch of information. 7Artisans logo, a 5-digit serial number, a spherical, and the lens specs, along with a 77mm filter thread, which is a big deal if you are using polarizing filters or ND filters. Inside there are 13 elements in 9 groups, with 2 aspherical elements, 3 ED low dispersion elements, 5 high refraction elements, and a 10 blade diaphragm. The goal of all of this is to reduce distortion, coma, and improve sharpness and bokeh. Mounted on a camera, this lens looks great. It's heavy, it's solid, and it's a good looking lens. But looks aren't everything, because this lens ultimately has to perform, and I'm happy to report that it does. Immediately I noticed how sharp this lens is. Granted, wide open is f4, but still, it's a very good performance in the center of the frame, and it's also surprisingly good in the corners. There's a little bit of vignetting, but the sharpness is definitely there, and there might be just a touch of softness in the very edge of the corners, but I'd say that about 95% of the frame is very sharp, wide open at f4. And it gets more impressive still because distortion is incredibly well controlled. This lens does not have any in-body lens corrections, but apart from that vignetting that I mentioned earlier, barrel distortion is non-existent. Chromatic aberration also is very well controlled. Flare performance, on the other hand, is not great, but if you use the lens hood and stop it down a little bit, it's fine. This lens also gives you a little bit of sunstar action past f5.6. If you are looking for a real estate lens on a budget, this might be an amazing option, and according to the comments on my last video, 15mm on a full frame is plenty wide enough. If you want a nice landscape lens, this is also not a bad choice. It's sharp, especially stop down with little distortion. Even for astrophotography, this lens could do it. This is a very easy lens to use. The focus ring is very smooth, plenty of rotation for an ultra wide angle. I was able to get focus pretty easily with this thing. And I have to reiterate the value here, because full frame lenses in general, if I were to throw out a ballpark estimate, are about twice the price of an APS-C lens. So the equivalent of this lens in APS-C would be if 7Artisans came out with a 10mm for about $175 US. It would be insane, and I would not think twice about picking it up, especially if it had the performance as far as sharpness in the center and on the edges and in the corners, and it was all metal in build as this lens is. It really is an incredible value when you think about it. And if you were planning on using this lens for video work, it has very little focus breathing, which is also an impressive thing. So what are the negatives? There are a couple of things. The vignetting wide open and the somewhat poor flare performance is one thing. The second is the minimum focus distance is 0.4 of a meter, so you can't do dramatic close-up ultra wide shots. And this also means you don't get much bokeh from this lens. Third, there is no weather sealing, so you do have to be careful in the rain and around dust or sand, but that's pretty much it. I was expecting this lens to be much worse than it is, but it's surprisingly good, especially for the money. And if you are interested in reading more about this lens or possibly picking it up, I'll leave some links down in the description below, so definitely check those out. It's a cool little lens from 7Artisans, again, better than I expected, so it gets a thumbs up from me. Stay tuned for more. Thank you guys so much for all of your comments, all of your likes, and your support. I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye-bye.